A number of researchers have claimed in recent years that war is on the decline, most notably Steven Pinker in his 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. New analysis, however, suggests that we shouldn't be too quick to celebrate a more peaceful world. Beer F. Braumoeller is an associate professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Political Science at Ohio State University. He has previously held faculty positions at Harvard University and at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Professor Braumoeller's research is in the areas of international relations, especially international security and statistical methodology. His substantive research includes a new book-length systemic theory of international relations, the great powers, and the international system. He is here today to address us on the topic of the spread of peace and the spread of war, explaining an apparent paradox. Professor Braumoeller, the floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you very much for your kind welcome, and thanks very much to the Norwegian Nobel Institute and to the director and research director for the invitation to come here and speak today. It's a profound honor for me to be here. Almost 30 years ago, I chose to devote my life to the study of war in the hopes that a better understanding of war would help to create peace. That goal has led me down some unusual paths, from diplomatic history to statistical methodology to systemic theory, but all with the same goal: to understand war and promote peace. I have proudly served on the governing board of the Peace Science Society International. So speaking at the Norwegian Nobel Institute, in the same room in which Peace Prize laureates have given their lectures, words cannot adequately convey my gratitude for such an honor. Thank you. I was invited here, as Asla mentioned, because I am currently doing research on the decline of war thesis. This is an argument made by a growing number of social scientists, including Steven Pinker at Harvard, some of the researchers at Uppsala and Prio, and my own colleague at Ohio State University, John Mueller. These scholars claim that thanks to things like the gradual expansion of human empathy and the spread of norms of nonviolence, the frequency and intensity of war are in decline and have been in decline for many decades. These are colleagues for whom I have quite a bit of respect. In particular, I've known John Mueller since I was a graduate student. My first professional teaching job was a semester-long visiting appointment at Rochester University, and the highlight of every week was a chat with John at his house before he took me back to the airport. He's a brilliant guy. He's known for challenging the conventional wisdom, and he's usually right. At this point, I have an awkward confession to make. When I started to explore the argument that the institution of warfare is in decline and has been for some time, I soon came to the conclusion that I didn't believe it. That conclusion prompted me to dig further, to look at different measures, and to learn new statistical methodologies and apply them to the task. And having done so, I still don't believe it. So my first reaction to the invitation to come here and speak was, I can't go to the Norwegian Nobel Institute and say that the world isn't becoming more peaceful. After a fair bit of reflection, I decided to come anyway. And the reason is this: I don't think that the bad news about war is necessarily bad news about peace. In fact, I think that for much of the last 2 centuries, we've seen both the spread of war and the spread of peace. John and Steve and all the Prio scholars are entirely correct when they say that the world is becoming a more peaceful place. but it has not become less warlike at the same time. In fact, just the opposite. My goal in the next 40 minutes or so is to convince you that I'm not crazy and that what I just said makes sense. Let me start by discussing the decline of war thesis. I'll focus on the three authors whose work is most closely associated with it. John Mueller argues that the institution of war, like the institutions of dueling and slavery before it, is simply going out of style. In Retreat from Doomsday, he argued that the change in attitudes was taking place among developed countries. In his follow-up book, The Remnants of War, he argued that the normative prohibition against war, which was largely the product of the horrors of the First World War, has been spreading from developed countries to the rest of the world ever since. To the obvious question, why was there a Second World War? Mueller argues that it was, quote, fabricated almost single-handedly by history's supreme atavism, Adolf Hitler. In Winning the War on War, Joshua Goldstein argues that the decrease in warfare is quite recent, and he does not argue that it's irreversible. He explicitly does not argue that the evolution of civilization has produced increasingly strong norms of nonviolence. Goldstein does argue that the end of the Cold War helps explain the reduction in violence after 1989, but he points to peacekeeping as the key causal variable. He argues that peacekeeping started having an impact on war in 1945 and accelerated after 1989, mostly due to the effect that peacekeeping has on the durability of post-war settlements. Steven Pinker, in his best-selling book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, argues that there has been a gradual decline in violence in general over the course of centuries, that both the frequency and intensity of international conflict have decreased since 1945, and that we now live in what is arguably the most peaceful period in history. He argues that three overlapping and somewhat irregular processes have driven this decline. The pacification process, humanity's transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural civilizations, the civilizing process, the gradual strengthening of domestic authority and the growth of commerce, and the humanitarian revolution, the expansion of empathy that resulted in the abolition of slavery, dueling, and cruel physical punishment, and in an increase in pacifism. While these arguments differ in terms of the reasons that they posit for a decline in warfare, the exact aspects of warfare that they think have declined, and the duration of that decline, it is possible to discern two core arguments that make up the decline of war thesis, each of which is emphasized to different degrees by different authors. One, states use force against one another less often than they did decades or centuries ago. Two, when wars do occur, fewer people die in them than in decades past. When I started exploring the evidence presented in favor of these arguments, I discovered that these claims were based on surprisingly little data. This may seem like a bold statement, given that all three books contain data analysis of some sort. Steven Pinker's book alone is over 800 pages long and contains, by my count, 116 distinct figures. Most of these figures, however, contain data that relate to his larger claim that all forms of human violence are in decline. They chart changes in rates of homicide, judicial torture, spousal abuse, and so on, even spanking. The charts that relate to interstate warfare are located at the end of Chapter 5 and the beginning of Chapter 6. Of these charts, very few actually show worldwide trends in warfare. Most show trends in warfare either within Europe or among the great powers, which are almost without exception European. Granted, both Pinker and Mueller argue that the process of pacification began in the developed world, but they also argue that the process has spread far enough to the rest of the world that it's had an impact on war in general. When I looked for data on trends in the frequency of the use of force worldwide, however, I found not a single graph or table in any of the 3 books, or in the rest of the literature for that matter. The only exception is a 1999 conference paper written by Peter Brecke, who compiled a catalog of known conflicts with at least 25 fatalities from the 1400s to the present. Pinker reproduces Brecke's figure 2, which shows a general downward trend in the number of conflicts per year that were initiated in Europe since the 1400s, as figure 517 in his book. He does not reproduce Brecke's figure 1, which shows an even larger upward trend in the number of conflicts that were initiated worldwide in the same period. Unfortunately, the list of conflicts is very incomplete, and missing data make it very difficult to compare frequencies over time, so neither figure is really very helpful for our purposes. The data on fatalities, by contrast, do generally include all conflicts worldwide. But they measure the deadliness of war in an odd way, in battle deaths as a fraction of world population. Why is this odd? After all, we measure the deadliness of cancer or heart disease or pneumonia as a fraction of world population. Why not wars? The short answer is that wars are not diseases. Anyone could get pneumonia or cancer, but every person on Earth is not potentially at risk of death from a war fought between 2 small African nations. And deaths in war are not viruses or bacteria. They are the result of conscious human decisions to use force. One of the most important tenets of quantitative social science is this: use measures that reflect concepts and ideas as the people themselves understand them when they are making the decisions that you are trying to analyze. And I very much doubt that leaders make calculations about acceptable or unacceptable losses in terms of deaths per 100,000 world population. I'll give you an example. The Lopez War was named after the Paraguayan president who led his country into war against Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay in the 1860s. The body count was nowhere near that of the First or Second World War in absolute terms. As a percentage of world population, it was trivial. But it remains to this day the bloodiest war in Latin American history. By some estimates, Paraguay lost 70% of its adult male population. Paraguayans did not think of their losses as being small relative to the world's population. They thought of them as being horrifyingly large relative to their own. These deaths were the result of conscious decisions by the 3 allies to establish war aims that would have resulted in the partition and absorption of Paraguay, by Argentinian President Bartolomé Mitre to continue to push for those war aims once Paraguay had lost, and of Paraguayan President Francisco Solano Lopez to wage guerrilla warfare in the countryside until his own death brought the war to a close. I feel safe. Those decisions were what led to the catastrophic bloodshed of the Lopez War. I feel safe in concluding that they were based not on how many people would die relative to the populations of India and China, but rather on how many people would die relative to the populations of the combatants themselves. This measure, battle deaths divided by the pooled population of the combatants, is what the Correlates of War Project at the University of Michigan refers to as the intensity of war. Both the data on the occurrence of conflict and the data on fatalities suffer from another flaw: disaggregation across time. Instead of the number of conflicts initiated in a given year, for example, we are shown the total number of conflicts in a given year. Instead of the number of battle deaths in a given war, we are shown the number of battle deaths per year. The problem, of course, is that some wars last longer than others. The Korean War resulted in just over 900,000 battle deaths over the course of just 3 years. The Iran-Iraq War resulted in roughly 1.25 million battle deaths over the course of almost 8 years. If deaths are measured on an annual basis, this looks like progress. But the Iran-Iraq War was not less bloody than the Korean War. It just killed people more slowly. And the decline of war thesis argues that we are killing fewer people, not that we are killing people more slowly. Finally, none of these authors conduct any statistical tests to distinguish between real changes in the rate or intensity of warfare on the one hand, and the chance variation that we normally see from year to year on the other. This is a problem when it comes to measuring the rate of conflict onset, because it's hard to know whether you're looking at a real change or at random fluctuation. It's a much worse problem when it comes to war intensity, because war intensity follows a power law distribution, meaning roughly that there are a lot of very small wars and a small number of very, very big ones. As Nassim Nicholas Taleb has pointed out, distributions like these make it extremely difficult to spot changes over time because our perception of the difference between time periods can be dramatically distorted by a few very large events. Even standard statistical tests give misleading answers because the small sample properties of most tests, when applied to data like these, are unbelievably bad. So unless we use tests that are designed with the challenges of these distributions in mind, we are very, very likely, as Taleb puts it, to be fooled by randomness. So what happens if we limit ourselves to analyses of the decline of war that include all possible combatants, use correct measures like war intensity and rate of conflict onset, and take into account the statistical challenges involved in detecting changes in these measures over time? We end up with virtually nothing. I've been able to find only one analysis of the deadliness of war that involves a useful test of change over time. Lars-Erik Cederman, T. Camber Warren, and Didier Sonnet's 2011 article in International Organization entitled Testing Clausewitz, Nationalism, Mass Mobilization, and the Severity of War. And that article shows an increase in the deadliness of war at about the time that Napoleon revolutionized warfare by introducing the levée en masse. It finds no significant decline in war severity after that point. Excuse me for just a second. So, the next part of the story can be told fairly briefly. I constructed the relevant measures and conducted statistical tests to look for changes over time. Most relevant to this discussion, I looked at the frequency with which military force was used by one country against another, as captured by the correlates of war's militarized interstate dispute data. I should emphasize that these are officially authorized uses of force, not just border skirmishes. Someone in a position of authority on one side or the other has to give the order to use force. This strikes me as the most reasonable point at which to draw the big red line that, according to the decline of war theorists, humanity is increasingly unwilling to cross. I then measured the annual rate of the use of force by dividing that number by the total number of opportunities for conflict, as measured by the number of so-called politically relevant pairs of states in the international system. In the most straightforward definition, a pair of states is politically relevant if the states are contiguous, or if at least one of the states is a major power. I used a slightly more complex measure that I can talk about later if you want, but the basic idea is very similar, and the choice of which one to use doesn't matter for the results. I also looked at the intensity of warfare as measured by battle deaths divided by the pooled population of the combatants. For the statistics nerds in the audience, I ran these data through a non-parametric hierarchical change point detection algorithm. The algorithm is designed to separate signal, real changes in the rate of the use of force, from noise, random variation. It's really robust because it doesn't rely on distributional assumptions, and because it's built on permutation tests, it's also very powerful. The good news is that there was, in fact, a significant drop in the rate of conflict initiation just after the end of the Cold War. That part of the decline of war argument does hold up to scrutiny. The bad news is that that's the only good news. There has been no significant decline in the rate of international conflict initiation since the end of the Cold War. What is worse, leaving aside the spikes in conflict initiation that characterized the two world wars, the end of the Cold War represents the first significant decline in the rate of international conflict initiation for nearly 200 years. Even worse, the period between the Napoleonic Wars and the end of the Cold War is characterized by a steady series of increases in the rate of the use of force worldwide. Specifically, in the first third of the century following the Napoleonic Wars, the median rate of conflict initiation was 0. The majority of years were characterized by no conflicts at all. In the last 2/3 of that period, the median rate of conflict initiation was 7 uses of force per 1,000 relevant dyads per year. During the interwar period, the median was 10 uses of force per 1,000 relevant dyads per year. During the Cold War, the median was 15 uses of force per 1,000 relevant dyads per year. And after the Cold War, the median rate of conflict drops very significantly back down to 6 uses of force per 1,000 relevant dyads per year. So far from representing progress toward peace, the Cold War was the most violent period on record, except for the two world wars. These numbers make a lot of sense, I suspect, to students of diplomatic history. The Concert of Europe period from the early to mid-1800s was remarkable for the degree to which the great powers joined together to manage conflict. The latter half of the 19th century saw increasing conflict among great powers over colonies, as well as a rash of militarized disputes in Latin America following the dissolution of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. The interwar period witnessed continued conflict in the Far East and ongoing stability in Europe that snowballed in the 1930s. And the Cold War was the first period in which two superpowers fought proxy wars across the globe. The sudden collapse of the Soviet Union corresponded with a significant drop in the rate at which force was used in international affairs. And that rate has remained relatively constant since that time. This is, of course, not consistent with the hypothesis that humanity's steadily growing aversion to war has led to a decline in war over time, even when we take random fluctuations into account. It is also somewhat difficult to square with Joshua Goldstein's thesis that peacekeeping is a major driver of overall rates of conflict initiation. The decrease in conflict after the Cold War is actually so big, a 2/3 reduction, that I find it difficult to believe that peacekeeping deserves all of the credit. That said, there is some support for the peacekeeping claim in the statistical literature on the subject. I should qualify that statement by noting that that literature is fraught with endogeneity. Anything that makes peacekeeping more likely to occur also makes it more necessary, a fact that makes estimation of its effects very difficult. A student of mine, Aisha Bradshaw, is working on exactly this problem. But with that caveat, the literature today does seem to support the claim that peacekeeping significantly reduces the probability that conflict will recur. So while I doubt that peacekeeping is the whole answer, it is most likely part of the answer. Turning to the deadliness of war, I looked at correlates of war data on war intensity using the same change point algorithm. Because the data are thick-tailed, however, I also used some more specific tests, Kolmogorov-Smirnov and Anderson-Darling tests for differences in distributions, and a test devised by Aaron Clauset, Cosma Shalisi, and Mark Newman for use with power law distributions. There is no established procedure, as far as I know, for testing for differences in the slope coefficients for power law distributed data, but Clauset et al. Used bootstrap standard errors, so I simply bootstrapped the difference between the empirical sampling distributions. Here, the bottom line is simple. There has been no significant change in the intensity of warfare since 1815. The closest thing to a significant change point is 1945, but we can't rule out the possibility that it happened by chance. Even if it didn't happen by chance, it doesn't help the decline of war thesis because it was a change toward more deadly wars rather than less deadly ones. Why do we see no change? That's hard to say. The lethality of wars is a surprisingly understudied topic, but there is some good work on the subject. As my colleague Tanisha Fazal at Notre Dame has shown, battlefield medicine has dramatically increased our ability to save the lives of wounded soldiers in the past century. If I had to speculate as to what these numbers mean, I'd say that improvements in the technology for killing people have roughly kept pace with improvements in the technology for saving them. We certainly don't find any evidence that a norm of nonviolence has reduced the deadliness of war unless something else has increased it in equal measure. Now, as I already said, I don't like these answers. I tried using a lot of different measures to find out whether they were robust. I looked at different levels of the use of force. I looked at different measures of political relevance. I looked at different measures of the deadliness of war, including battle deaths as a percentage of world population, even though I think it's a useless statistic. None of these analyses revealed a sustained decline in the rate of conflict initiation. Most revealed just the opposite. And none, no matter which measure is used, revealed any decrease in the deadliness of war. Okay. So this sets up an interesting question. As I've already said, the central people in the decline of war literature are very smart people. They get cited a lot. Their books are actually bought by people who are not academics. They even appear on television sometimes. So how could they be wrong? The two simplest answers are that they looked at the wrong numbers and that they didn't use statistics. Those are both true, but that isn't the whole story. One part of the answer, I think, is that the decline of war theorists have failed to differentiate carefully enough between war and peace. In order to make sense out of that statement, I have to go back to the beginning of the peace science movement and the scholarship of Johan Galtung. Professor Galtung is no doubt very well known to this audience. He is a Norwegian sociologist and mathematician who founded PRIO and the Journal of Peace Research. To say that he has had a great influence on the field of peace science is a dramatic understatement. Simply put, he invented it. If the Nobel Institute were to start giving out memorial prizes in peace science, which I think would be an excellent idea, I would be amazed if Professor Galtung were not among the first recipients. And he is responsible for one of the most fundamental tenets in peace science, the idea that peace is more than just the absence of war. This point can be counterintuitive, especially for scholars like me who work in the quantitative tradition. Let me digress briefly to illustrate this point. I once wrote a paper called Paths to Peace that was accepted for presentation at a Peace Science Society conference. The point of the paper was that contrary to what most statistical models assume, the absence of war can happen in many ways. Two countries can be too weak and far apart to fight. They can both be democratic, one can be deterred by the other, and so on. When I arrived at the conference, I got a call telling me that my wife had been admitted to the emergency room at the hospital with a severe asthma attack. I had to leave, but I also had an obligation to the conference organizers. So I asked a former student of mine, Professor Sarah Croco, now at the University of Maryland, who is a far more dynamic speaker than I am, to present my paper for me. To my great relief, she agreed. When she reported back to me later, she said that everything had gone well. The paper had been well received, and there had been a somewhat surreal question and answer session in which my colleagues in the audience had prefaced their questions with things like, if you were Bear, what would you say to the following question? Or, what do you think Baer was thinking when he wrote this? She did mention being very confused by one question. Someone had gotten up and criticized the title in a very angry tone because, as he pointed out, it wasn't really about peace. It was just about the absence of war. Sarah could not have been more confused. Wars are coded as a 1 in the data set, she said, and peace is coded as a 0. Any model of war is implicitly a model of peace. What could this man have possibly meant that was a model of the absence of war rather than peace? I cringed when I heard her question. I asked her who had asked it, and she told me that it had been an older gentleman named Walter. Walter Izard, of course, was an economist and one of the main founders of the field of peace science. It was painful for me to learn that my title had made Walter angry, so I changed it. And I explained to Sarah what I should have explained when she was still my student, that peace, as understood by people like Johan Galtung and Walter Izard, was more than just the absence of war. In a 1967 manuscript titled Theories of Peace, Galtung makes an important distinction between what he calls negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is the absence of organized collective violence. This is the sort of peace that countries like North and South Korea have experienced following the ceasefire that ended the hostilities in the Korean War. They're not actively killing one another, but that's about the best you can say for the situation. Positive peace, according to Galtung, is quite different. As he puts it, this is peace as a synonym for all other good things in the world community, particularly cooperation and integration between human groups, with less emphasis on the absence of violence. The concept would exclude major violence, but tolerate occasional violence. Galtung clearly sees positive peace as being a more profound and meaningful form of peace, a positive and cooperative relationship, rather than the simple absence of a negative one. It's important to note, however, that because peace is not the same thing as the absence of war, the spread of peace, of positive peace that is, does not necessarily imply the diminution of war. In fact, as my colleagues Gary Gertz, Paul Diehl, and Alexandru Balas have shown in their new book, The Puzzle of Peace, truly peaceful relationships in the positive peace sense have been on the rise throughout the Cold War and into the post-Cold War period. By their measure, the relationships of 7.2% of all politically relevant states could be characterized by positive peace at the beginning of the Cold War. By the end of the Cold War, the percentage had more than doubled to 16.6%. After the end of the Cold War, the percentage remains roughly the same. But of that 16%, a majority of states transitioned from what Gertz and co-authors call warm peace, the lowest level of positive peace, characterized among other things by the absence of war plans against one another and the presence of significant commonalities of interest, to a Deutschian security community in which we see a degree of integration, coordination, and dependable expectation of peaceful change. I think they're correct in that assessment. But precisely because peace is not synonymous with the absence of war, it is possible for these two trends, the spread of peace and the spread of war, to coexist. The big question is, how? And here, we get to another part of the problem in the decline of war literature. Their focus is simply too narrow. Quite a lot of research over the past 20 years, especially work done by Bruce Russett and his colleagues, has shown that a Kantian peace exists within the Western liberal international order. A lot of the examples from the decline of war literature come from Europe in the last 70 years, and I think that's the best case you can make for the decline of war argument. As historians well know, however, the Western liberal order is hardly unique. Attempts to create international order, by which I mean a set of coercive laws and practices reflective of an underlying principle of legitimacy and balance of power, to which some set of powerful states submits in a functional bargain, as Professor Zarakal calls it, that trades autonomy for security date back at least to the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. It is inherent in such orders to quell violence among their constituent units, that is, to create negative peace. International orders aimed specifically at the promotion of positive peace are a more recent development, but even at a conservative estimate, they've been around for over 200 years. Why does that matter? Here I'm getting into the more speculative part of the project, and I may well change my mind before it comes out in print. I might actually change my mind before 7:30 if questions are pointed enough, we'll see. But I think the answer has a lot to do with the complex nature of political order in general. As the sociologist Charles Tilly famously wrote, "War made the state, and the state made war." This is an elegant statement of a truism. Warfare was part of the process of the formation of political order within modern states, an order that was synonymous, at least, with negative peace and ideally with positive peace. Once those states had formed, however, they used war to survive and thrive in the larger system of states. My hypothesis is that Tilly's insight applies to international political orders as well, and that the creation of international political orders and their relationship to one another is largely responsible for the patterns of violence that we see over the past 2 centuries. International orders, for the most part, decrease the incidence of violence within their sphere. On the other hand, when competing international orders collide, they encounter a new issue, the nature of the political ordering principles to which states should subscribe, that has the potential to generate conflict where none had previously existed. Conflict over the nature of international order is especially pernicious because principles of legitimacy are generally indivisible. There is no way to divide the pie and arrive at a compromise. For that reason, the most peaceful periods on record are periods in which one international order is dominant, meaning not that it spans the globe, but that it faces no substantial external competition. The Cold War is an outstanding example of this interplay between internal peace and external conflict. The Western liberal international order did not, of course, exist in a vacuum. Its formation was greatly aided by the existence and likely expansionist tendencies of another world order based in Moscow that saw itself as the inevitable successor to the liberal capitalist West. As Professor Sir Michael Howard put it in his brilliant little book, The Invention of Peace, it was a confrontation between two sides with incompatible visions of world order, each believing that peace ultimately could be established only by the elimination of the other. At the same time, and partly as a result, peace spread within the Western camp as the North Atlantic Security Community formed and solidified. The Soviet Union managed conflict within its own sphere as well. Although the result was not quite as peaceful, Gertz and co-authors still cite the Warsaw Pact as an example of positive peace. Here, then, are the two faces of international order. Peace was fostered within international orders, while conflict was fostered across them. Other periods in the 19th and 20th centuries follow the same logic. The concert of Europe was forged in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. It remained entirely unopposed by any other scheme for producing international order. And while it operated, warfare was all but absent from the continent. After the First World War, another order was born, a liberal one grounded in the League of Nations. But it was soon opposed by two revisionist international orders arising from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The resulting broken balance, in Professor Taliaferro's words, was characterized by extreme uncertainty and volatility. The post-Cold War world has witnessed a remarkable reduction in conflict, not only because of the existence of the Western liberal order, but because that order has been unopposed in any meaningful way since the late 1980s. It's tempting to portray this as a narrative that pits the Enlightenment as a side of peace against successive resurgences of bellicose counter-Enlightenment thinking. To do so, however, would be gravely ahistorical. The international order constructed by Castlereagh, Metternich, and the other architects of the Vienna settlement was anything but liberal. The Concert of Europe, which was formed to preserve a conservative order and prevent liberal uprisings in the wake of the French Revolution, owed more to Edmund Burke than to Immanuel Kant. Told from this perspective, the story of the decline in warfare following the Cold War takes on an entirely different hue. The hero is not Immanuel Kant or an increasingly enlightened human race, but rather Mikhail Gorbachev, a fact recognized and recognized wisely, I think, by this institute in 1990. So, if this perspective is correct, and I am increasingly convinced that it is, what are the implications for minimizing or eradicating warfare as an instrument of national policy going forward? First of all, it's not clear that we can count on the Western liberal world order to continue to expand the zone of peace that it created over the course of the last half-century. Indeed, it may be reaching the limits of its own attractiveness to the rest of the world. If the recent surge in the popularity of populist politicians in countries like Austria, France, Poland, Switzerland, and the United States is any indication, it may even be beginning a slow backward slide. It's not clear how long Americans will continue to see value in the present degree of integration, or whether Europeans will want to remain tethered to, in former Director Lundestad's memorable caricature, vulgar, gas-guzzling, hormone-eating supporters of the death penalty. He left out deniers of anthropogenic climate change, but other than that, it sounds about right to me. In other words, if this is indeed an American empire by invitation, we might be wearing out our welcome. The erosion or dissolution of the Atlantic community could well reverse the impressive trend toward peace that characterized its growth and maturation. At the same time, as I hope to have made clear, the widespread belief that humanity is on the threshold of perpetual peace and that we need do little save bask in our own goodness in order to enjoy it is almost certainly unfounded. Moreover, if this belief forms the basis of policy, it might actually be dangerous. If it prompts us to ignore a rising threat, or contributes to the sentiment that the growth of international order is superfluous, the belief that mankind is becoming more peaceful could, perversely, make the world a more dangerous place. That said, I do think the historical record confirms the viability of the idea of an international order in which war plays no part. We've managed to create multiple working prototypes over the last 200 years. Importantly, we've shown that they can be based on very different principles of political legitimacy. At the same time, the record seems to indicate that international orders based on different principles coexist tenuously at best, catastrophically at worst. And although the Kantian peace is founded on cosmopolitan principles, in practice, its core has been Western liberal democracies, with a broad range of shared values, culture, and history. We don't really know whether or how well it can be extended to the rest of the world. So all of this leaves us with a set of hard questions to which the data really can't speak. Questions like, what are the limits of a cosmopolitan international order? What degree of order can reasonably be sustained outside of the common ideology and culture of the North Atlantic community? Can we even maintain international order in the long run within the North Atlantic community in the absence of external threats? If we cannot, to what extent would Europe play an independent role in building order? Would it work to maintain and expand its zone of peace? Or would there continue to be, as Asla Toja argues, a consensus expectations gap that will undermine Europe's ability to act as a great power? Is the current Western liberal order a help or a hindrance to the project of a more universal order? That is, if the West is satisfied with our current two-tiered international order, NATO and the EU for us, the UN for everyone else, where is the incentive for the major powers to deepen and strengthen global institutions? If multiple regional orders evolve in the Middle East, Asia, and perhaps in a more independent Europe, can we successfully manage their interactions? And finally, perhaps my darkest fear, does the drive to maintain international order weaken as the memory of cataclysmic war fades into the past? I'm eager to hear your thoughts on the answers to these questions. As you might have guessed, I'm pessimistic about the answers to many of them myself. But if our goal is to reduce war as well as to spread peace, we cannot simply rely on human nature. We should instead maintain as our aim, as one of your recent laureates put it, a gradual evolution of human institutions that will move us toward a more inclusive international order, built by consensus and in our own self-interest, to protect each of us from all of us. Thank you very much.
Professor Braumoeller, thank you ever so much. That was fascinating, stimulating, and I'm sure we're going to have a fruitful questions and answers session. But first we will take a 10-minute recess to recharge our glasses and come up with the most clever questions we're capable of. Thank you so much. So the way we'll run this is that So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do this the simplest way possible. Please indicate to me if you wish to pose a question, and then you pose it, and then Professor Braumoeller will answer to the best of his abilities. The floor is now open. That's Betsy Kalmura.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. In terms of the different kinds of peace, you talked about like negative peace. You talked about negative peace and positive peace. How do you think the international responsibility to protect plays a role in your scenario of peace or conflict? Because in terms of the international responsibility to protect, maybe that would provoke people from, bring them boots on the ground kind of thing. So.
It's an interesting question, and this is something that I've grappled with a bit because, I think the standard answer from the sort of Kantian peace literature is that when you have this sort of spread of liberal norms, the result is more peace. But responsibility to protect and humanitarian interventions in general are a very interesting counterargument to that point, because once you see the rise of increasingly liberal governments in Europe in the early 1800s, you see things like the British starting to care about the Greek Civil War, which they would not have cared about before, or you certainly wouldn't have seen the same sort of reaction to it. So, I think every international order has its ordering principles. And every set of ordering principles implies activities on the part of other countries that are acceptable or unacceptable. And so I think we don't really talk enough in the peace literature about the broader implications of things like responsibility to protect, right? Now, I think one of the reasons that responsibility to protect has taken hold as much as it has is that people have made a very hard decision, which is to say, we're completely against war, but sometimes it's worth it, right? Sometimes war is better than the alternative. And that's a value judgment that's going to be made in like I said, in just about any international order. But it very much complicates the story that I was telling about the spread of international order leading to peace. And in particular, it leads to a real dilemma, I think, with the idea of a cosmopolitan international order, a global international order, because it's not entirely clear to me whether such an order could be founded entirely on procedural grounds, right, without any sort of substantive content. And there's sort of a double-edged sword in trying to form a cosmopolitan international order, because if you maintain the substantive content, right, then you're going to maintain that sort of list of things that are prescribed and that might actually justify war despite your desire for greater peace. On the other hand, if you create sort of a broader cosmopolitan order that is sort of substantively more open, right, less specifically Western and liberal, as some theorists have urged we do. Kwame Anthony Appiah, for example, his work on cosmopolitanism. Then you run into the problem of, is it really worth the candle, right? I mean, are we willing to watch the news reports scroll in day after day of people being shot, child brides, genital mutilation, all of these things? Like, aren't these causes worth fighting for? It's not a question I think that science can really help with. It's a normative question, right? And it's something that we need to work out, but it's a very difficult challenge. I hope that was a very meandering answer. I'm sorry. I just sort of went all over the place, but I hope that at least got to the nut of the question you were asking.
Hi, my question is just basically, my name is Jacob, by the way, but my question is, so you spoke about the long-term kind of trend, but and this might be fraught with danger, but what about, say, the last 5 years? From 2010 to 2015, the data obviously is not all in, but what's your analysis of those years? Has it been more wars going on in those years?
Yes. So this is one of Taleb's criticisms of Pinker. He refers to him as a journalist, right? By which he means he doesn't take statistics into account, and he follows trends. That's a good analogy. So like political race, right? And we get this all the time, especially now in the United States. We just see headlines, oh, you know, Trump has drawn even with Clinton in the presidential race in the poll averages. Well, if you look at the poll averages, they bounce around a lot. But journalists get really excited when there's one spike or one data point. And that's probably an unrepresentative data point, but every story in the newspaper is about why did we see this sudden spike. My wife is a journalist. I give her all sorts of grief about the propensity of journalists to do this sort of thing. By the same token, after writing his book, Steven Pinker sort of dedicated himself to continuing to be in the news on the subject and continuing to follow up on the story. So every year, somewhere you can track down a story from him saying, there's been a downward blip, there's been an upward blip, there's been, the world got better in these ways and worse in these ways. So oddly enough, I think the best argument against the Pinker thesis in the last 5 years is Pinker himself, who's sort of tracked these data with a meticulousness that's quite impressive, and sort of gone into detail about each new conflict and so on and so forth. And so, since I try to keep up on what he writes, one of the things that I've noticed is that over the past couple of years there have been upticks in conflicts that are going on. Now, not to fall victim to my own criticism, I doubt they're statistically significant. But what we've seen in the past couple of years are a couple of upward blips.
My name is Stein Tønneson. I'm a researcher at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, former director, and I'm adjunct professor at Uppsala University, so I combine the two institutions that are behind much of the data that is being used in the books that you cited. I welcome very much your talk and also the book manuscript. You told me in the break that you have 200 pages ready of. I think that all the books that you mentioned are really readable. I think that Joshua's book is the one closest to my heart because it's on the contemporary period only, but John Miller's is the most readable one of them. And they are also debatable, so by being confronted by all the criticism that you come up with, I think that we will move forward. But let me concentrate now on my disagreements. First is, I think that there is that I don't often meet people who think that we are on the verge of perpetual peace. I don't think I often meet people who think that we are on the verge of perpetual peace. When I speak with people, they normally say that if you are a peace researcher, you will never lose your anything to do, because they believe that war is something that is innate in mankind. So the fact that nations have been able to overcome internal warfare, that whole regions or orders, as you said, have managed to reduce it, create a kind of hope that could be positive, normatively speaking. But I agree very much with Joshua that this is not irreversible, the trend that we have seen. Then I think that it makes sense to concentrate when we discuss more about the big wars. Because they are the ones that really cost lives, and they are the most dangerous for the whole international order as well. And that is not so often done when you use statistics. But the big thing is that we've not had a Third World War. The Second World War was by far the worst that happened in the 20th century. The war that you talked about in Paraguay was the third worst war in the 19th century after the Taiping Rebellion and the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. in terms of the number of battle deaths. And here I don't speak about percentage, but about absolute numbers of battle deaths, according to Claude Felter's book. Then you spoke mainly about international wars, not so much about civil wars, but the 3 books that you mentioned, they include civil wars as well. And the civil wars represent the clear majority of all the wars that have been, and they have been in the majority all the time. The idea that we used to have interstate wars between unified armies in the past, and then we've got more and more civil wars, is a clear myth. So if you look at the correlates of wars, list of wars since 1815, the international wars are about 15%, 1-5. When you use militarized interstate disputes as the basis for your counting, I think there are some obvious mistakes one could make, which I assume you are aware of and have not made in what you said, but just to ask you that the registering of small interstate disputes has clearly become better over time. So if you compare over time incidents long ago and incidents now, you will tend to see an increase. And I've seen several articles arguing that there is an increase in armed conflict worldwide based on that mistake. The other is that many of the militarized interstate disputes are not lethal. And there are quite a lot of them that are related to fisheries, where you have military boats that intervene against illegal fishing. And this is in a way another kind of animal than the one you can use when you go into statistical arguments. So therefore I believe that to use actually our statistics in Uppsala Prio for armed conflicts defined as armed conflicts with a minimum of 25 battle deaths in 1 year, or wars with a minimum of 1,000, makes quite a lot of sense. I also would really argue that to compare regions makes sense, also when you talk about international orders. And that's why I have been leading a research program for the last 6 years on why East Asia has become so peaceful. Because East Asia is not an area with an international order. It's an region actually with a lot of disputes, lot of militarized interstate disputes that have not escalated to war in a long time. And it's also the region that could lead to a major world war and an absolute catastrophe. So it warrants studies of its own. When you look at conflicts, you criticized us for talking about ongoing conflicts instead of conflict initiations. But we also have data sets for onsets and endings. And one of the things we find there is that this runs contrary to what one would often think, is that there are lots of initiations all the time and lots of endings all the time. So when you see that it's the same number in 2 years of armed conflicts worldwide, it's rarely the same. And finally, I would say that I presented a paper to the International Studies Association conference in Atlanta, where I argued something which runs contrary to you and contrary to Galtung and contrary to virtually everyone in the peace research community, and that is that I made a case for negative peace. I think peace is the absence of war or the absence of violence. That makes it tangible, that makes it measurable. Once you venture into this idea of positive peace, you don't manage to define it. And the book you just referred to, The Puzzle of Peace, and the way it defines peace, will be discussed at Prio next month, and I'm going to debunk the authors.
Thank you. Where to begin? First of all, I'll definitely look up the ISA paper because it sounds like I've had similar qualms about especially given that positive peace allows for the occasional use of force. It makes me wonder, how exactly do you grapple with it? And I'll be very curious to hear how the authors respond to your critiques. Going back to the beginning, I mean, if I think your first argument is not many people buy the decline of war argument. I think, I don't know, I'm not sure that that's entirely been my experience, and one of the reasons that initially I didn't really want to write this book. I didn't want to write anything on the subject. I read John's book, and I thought, it's debatable, but you know, John's a pretty smart guy. He's often right. Maybe I'm just missing something. Then I read Pinker's book, and I thought, nah, I just don't buy it. You know, but I'm sure that someone in the peace science community will come along and debunk it before too long. And then I saw the reviews, glowing reviews, you know. He's done this incredible job, look at all the data. And I thought, really, no one's gonna take this on. So maybe I'll take a closer look at the data, and that's how things started. And so part of the reason that I got involved in this project in the first place is that a lot of, you know, pretty well-respected colleagues of mine seem to be, at least in print, you know, maybe not in private in the back rooms, but in print, we're sort of, you know, signing on to this idea. And it seems to be gaining a remarkable degree of currency, shocking to my mind, in the popular press. And I thought, you know, we make these big, complicated statistical models of war and peace. If we can't really tell whether a trend is going up or down, we really ought to hang up our hats and go home. You know, we ought to be able to figure this out. But that said, I really do believe in the ideal of the social science as science. And, you know, I hope very much that this starts a dialogue that really should have started a few years ago. And I think I know where it's going to end up. I'm not too sure. I think my job is to contribute to it and sort of push the ball forward. And I look forward to seeing where it goes after that. As far as big wars, the big wars fading, this is a point that, you know, that Pinker made, that we've seen, you know, this unusual long piece. Actually, I mean, quoting John Lewis Gaddis about the long piece. And this also, one of the frustrations that I have with that argument is, if you look at Jack Levy's work on major power wars, going back to the 1400s, you see that the average number of them is about 2 per year. So if you take if you come up with a simple test, right, you imagine that every year dice are rolled, and there's a 1 chance in 50 that a major power war is going to happen. And then ask yourself, all right, after 70 years, what's the probability that we would have 0 wars? The probability is 24%. It's not that unlikely. Even if the underlying rate of major power war initiation has remained stable, that we would actually see 70 years of peace. So, and as soon as I mentioned this in a different context, someone asked me, you know, how long do we have to go before you reach the magic 5% threshold? And I think the answer is somewhere around 150 years, all told. So the odds are I won't be seeing, you know, it's a wonderfully safe prediction to make, because I can only be right, I can't be wrong until well after I'm dead. But as far as big wars, I think the other thing I'd say, you did mention that a lot of the biggest wars that we've seen have been in the 1800s, but we've also, when I plotted the intensity of war over time, one of the things that struck me was that World War I and World War II were only the 4th and 5th highest spikes in the distribution. The Lopez War was one. Another war involving Paraguay was another. Paraguay had a very rough 100 years or so, and the Iran-Iraq War was the 3rd. And those are actually spaced out fairly evenly over the course of the last 200 years. So I'll leave it at that. The Civil War question, You're absolutely right. I mean, no doubt that most of the wars that happen are civil wars. I face a bit of a dilemma in this project because one of my frustrations with Professor Pinker's book is that it ranges from criminology to archaeology to international relations to all these other things, and it sounds good, but then when you talk to area specialists in those areas, they say, we have a much better story about crime, or we have a much better story about native tribes, or we have a much better story about whatever. So I don't want to be hypocritical and wander too far out of my area, and frankly, I'm not a student of civil wars, and it's a bit of a cop-out, but there really is, despite Lemke's article a few years back, Lemke and, oh God, that thing's probably rolling, isn't it? Lemke and co-author, a few years back, arguing that civil wars and international wars have essentially the same causes. I'm pretty skeptical. I mean, the Civil War people seem to have arrived at a list of arguments that differ pretty dramatically from what makes sense to me in terms of international conflict. That said, I did look into civil conflict, and as we were saying earlier, the PRIO data, the correlates of war data do exist. Most Civil War people I know don't use them. I asked someone, Paul Staniland at Chicago, and he said, Civil War people are data snobs. We really don't like those data. But you don't see much of a trend. You don't see an upward or downward trend after World War I at all in those data. And in the Uppsala data, you see an increase in initiations following the end of the Cold War, right? So, and I think probably, I'll be mentioning this in the book, probably I can improve on what Stathis Kalivas and his co-authors have written about technologies. Technologies have changed. Technologies of warfare changing after the end of the Cold War. Now, as to small mids being more readily measured, yeah. So one of the things that I did was try to take a look at, limited it to only wars in which force was actually, only mids in which force is actually used. So on a 5-point scale, these were level 4 and level 5 only. So that gets rid of the fishing disputes, and it gets rid of a lot of the sort of unobserved conflicts that happened in past centuries. Not all of them, right? But until we find a better data source that actually includes those mids, it's really difficult for me to do very much except say, okay, how bad would the data have to be for us to believe that there's a decline in warfare? And I don't have the numbers right in front of me that I just rattled off. This is one of the downsides of, this is my first presentation without PowerPoint, probably in more than a decade. So you'll have to excuse, normally I would call up a slide and sort of show you, show you the graph. But the increase in the rate of conflict, of mid-initiation, has been so substantial from 1815 through the end of the Cold War, that if you were to argue that it could be erased by better recording of, of level 4 and level 5 militarized disputes, you would have to hypothesize a staggering number of militarized interstate disputes in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm not convinced that I'm likely to find that. The other thing that, as I mentioned, that sort of increases my confidence that that the data makes sense is that they jibe pretty well with the diplomatic history on the subject. And I don't want to paint myself as a diplomatic historian. I'm far from perfect in that regard. But having read the history of the period and having looked over the conflicts that took place that are recorded in the literature outside the militarized interstate dispute data, which again suffer from the same problem, but at least it's an independent source. The numbers make sense. When I look at the trends, I think, maybe they should be, maybe the increase, the slope of the increase should be a little flatter because they're not picking up other conflicts. but the overall story seems to me to make a lot of sense. And I think I've checked off all of the, comparing regions, excellent idea. I've not thought about it at all, and I hate to talk about things that I haven't thought about, so I'll think about it some more. Thank you.
Espen Larsen, I'm with the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I enjoyed your presentation, Professor, and a particular point you made at the end, where you referred to policy making. And of course, as we both know, any policy based on myths or false assumptions makes for bad politics, or even counterproductive politics. So if, to the extent that you're a social science mythbuster, I salute you. Thank you for that. My question refers to something that you have alluded to a bit earlier in this session, and that's the distinction. You have this distinction between positive and negative peace, but if the long-run objective or what we're looking at here is a world order based on positive peace, and you want to measure the way we proceed or not proceed towards that goal, shouldn't there be a distinction made between positive and negative wars as well?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to fall back briefly on what I said just a moment ago. I haven't thought about it, and I hate to talk about things that I haven't thought about. But that's a neat idea, and I'd love to hear more about your sort of conceptualization of what positive and negative wars. You mean sort of like humanitarian wars, for example, or the responsibility to protect would fall into the positive war category, or something along those lines? Right. Yeah, right. You can. It's a tough road to go down, right? Because the Third Reich could make the same claim. Once we've won, we're going to have peace. It'll be negative peace, but there won't be any more fighting among countries because we will have absorbed them all. So I'm not sure exactly how to address that, but I'll think about it. As to the rest of the point, when you said something about sort of the policy implications and the goal of, getting to sort of a one big international world order, partly because of the room that I'm standing in, I'm reluctant to come across as deeply pessimistic about that, about the prospects for the possibility. But I think there really are some very major hurdles, and I sort of listed them at the end, and I'm not entirely convinced that they're ones that we're going to be able to overcome. So the working title of the manuscript is "Only the Dead," from the "Only the dead have seen the end of war." I've been wrestling as to whether or not to make it more optimistic, but at least that's my initial inclination. Maybe only the dead, mostly the dead. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, does it work? Yeah. My name is Kees van den Bos. I have to start with a simple question. You refer a lot to Steven Pinker, and then you describe your presentation, which I like very much, is very much concentrated on the more contemporary period. While I think the strength of Steven Pinker is that he sees it over a long-term period, the decline, and in his last chapters he deals more with the psychology and has the mind of man changed and that kind of thing, which is hardly referred to. So my critique is, are you not, I see it as you have a kind of critique on Steven Pinker's work. Is that correct? And if that is correct, are we not comparing different things? Because his main thing is the long-term view, while you concentrate on, say, the post-Napoleonic period, and he starts much earlier. My second point is also simple. If we, on the decline of war, if we take a different view, there is some recent research which starts with conflicts, be they interstatal or within states. And there is a database on conflicts, and that clearly shows that over the last 70 years, more conflicts have been solved in a peaceful way than in a war way, than with armed conflict. If you are aware of that research, isn't that a piece of hope then for the future, which shows that more and more conflicts are being solved in a peaceful way? Thank you.
So, thank you. That's a couple of interesting questions. So the first question about Pinker telling a bigger story, in terms of the sort of more multifaceted story that he's telling, the story about crime and human psychology and so on and so forth, I wouldn't pretend to be able to speak to those questions. Really, and I think part of the justification for focusing on what I'm focusing on is that it's something I can actually do. But what was I going to say? Another response. Oh, and as far as the sort of limited temporal scope is concerned, yeah, I'm already concerned about the quality of the data going back to 1815. When I looked up the conflict catalog data that Pinker used back to the 1400s, the quality were terrible. There were so many cases where the number of fatalities wasn't even recorded, and those cases were not evenly distributed across time. And it made me realize, I had actually hoped to go back farther than this using the same data that he used, but I wouldn't put my name on it, frankly. There just isn't a possibility, I think. Now, as far as more conflicts being resolved short of war, this is a really interesting question. And part of what I think we're seeing in the post-Cold War, during the Cold War, is what Paul Diehl and his colleagues have referred to as enduring rivalries, right? And that they're responsible, territorial disputes within enduring rivalries in particular are responsible for, a lot of conflict that we see. So, and you actually do see less of a propensity to escalate within those rivalries over time. That plausibly strikes me as a learning process within that rivalry, but not necessarily for humans across time in a broader context. One of the pieces of research that I did that I didn't present here because I didn't have time, and it really would require PowerPoint because the graphs are sort of necessary to tell the story. I went back over the last 10 years to look at studies of militarized interstate disputes in major journals in political science. Got a hold of the data, replicated as many of them as I could, and then looked at the primary causal variable in each one, whether it was dyadic democracy or trade or what have you. And then I put them into a statistical model that allowed the coefficients on those variables to vary over time. Because, and Pinker doesn't say this, and Mueller sort of hints at it, but he doesn't sort of come out and say it directly. I think one of the implications of the decline of war thesis is that the same things that caused war 20 or 30 or 50 years ago should have a lower probability of causing war now. The same stimulus should evoke a smaller response. So there's actually a way to test for that. And I took a look across, I think there were 56 different studies. And I don't have the final numbers because I'm still in the process of running them. But some of them got more potent, some of them got less potent, some of them stayed about the same. There really wasn't any compelling trend one way or the other in the data over time. So that was the kind of that was the way that I did think of the problem that you're discussing, and the best way that I could think of to analyze it was to take a look at the potency of the causes of war over time. And I wish I could say that there's a coherent story to be told, but there really isn't, as far as I can tell.
Geir Lundestad. I enjoyed your presentation tremendously. It was certainly ambitious. You tried to cover a lot of territory, maybe too much territory. And Stein, of course, was much too modest because, I mean, why do we keep referring to Pinker so much when so much of his findings in international relations is actually a result of the Prio-Uppsala studies? So I think you should have dealt, if you check his footnotes, I mean, so much on the international relations side, of course there's the rest of the book, is, I mean, he refers explicitly to Prio-Uppsala. So I think personally maybe you should have dealt more explicitly with Prio-Uppsala because there isn't really that much new on this point in Pinker. There are all the other aspects of the book which are more, there may be different opinions about how valuable they are, but on this side, a reference to Prio-Uppsala I think would be, should definitely be included. I mean, you wanted to take on so many issues, and all of these issues depend very much on definitions and numbers. And it's very difficult to have a detailed discussion about that here. So I think we have to refer to broader trends. I mean, for instance, I've become more and more interested in orders, and orders produce peace. This is the argument. Well, they produce peace at their climax. But they do not produce peace when they're established, because it often takes violence to establish the order. And they certainly do not establish peace when they're broken up. I mean, if you study the British Empire, for instance, yes, of course, all kinds of violence had to be used to establish the order. And when it collapsed, there was certainly violence. But even then, at the climax of the order, there was not a single year when not a British soldier was killed. I mean, there was always something going on, obviously, in this huge empire. And then you have the liberal order, yes, but orders are more or less by definition temporary. There's a reason they are created, and there's a reason that sooner or later they will be dissolved. But okay, so much for orders. I think there's much more to be said about this. I'm not sure that that was a necessary part of your presentation because you had so much to say about the liberal peace. I've been skeptical to the liberal peace argument with two exceptions. I think the two most worthwhile findings are not the general findings, but one, that after 1945, there, again, depending on definitions, there have been few, maybe no, major great power war. After 1945. This applies, of course, it applies only after 45. I mean, this is derived from John Gaddis's The Long Peace, which shows that it's true in Europe. And the many, many wars outside of Europe, there have been many such wars, but they are proxy wars. I mean, they are still major conflicts, but they are proxy wars. But again, it's a question of where do you draw the line? I mean, but that argument can be made. And the other argument I think that can be made is that after the end of the Cold War, or at the very end of the Cold War, there were, of course, many, many civil wars. Tremendous number. I mean, in former Yugoslavia, Caucasus, parts of Africa. But then, in the 90s, the number declined. I think this is a very interesting, very worthwhile finding. Although the latest numbers from Prio Uppsala, they indicate that the number is once again going up.
The latest, because it went up from 2014 to 15, because more people pay.
Yes, yes. It went down by 1, I think, or something. So it's...
the figures are out next week.
Okay, okay, I see. I haven't seen the figures being published next week, but okay. So I think these are the two most interesting findings in a way. Thank you.
Well, so I wouldn't disagree. Well, first of all, referencing Prio and Uppsala too much, more. Certainly there's a lot of work, and I am mentioning in the book and addressing in the book, partly, what I could squeeze into 45 minutes. Partly was a question of not trying to offend multiple Norwegian institutions at the same time. But no, certainly there is a lot of work. But I stand by the statement that I made in the talk, which was that once I sort of listed the criteria for measuring the rate of conflict initiation and the intensity of war, I haven't found very many, if any, papers that take those on directly. There are, I think it was it Lucina Gleditsch and co-author who, maybe Lucina Gleditsch and Russet, who wrote about, I think it was the decline in the severity of war, but didn't take into account the problems with measurements and statistical distributions that I mentioned earlier. And when you do take that into account, you find that you don't see any trend. So it's not that I didn't mean to slight or ignore the researchers in that tradition. Yeah. Now, as far as orders being more complex, this, I completely agree, and I plan to make this my next book project, because the more I've gotten into this answer, the more I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I won't say a lot more than that, except, one of the potential implications of what you said, which is, it takes war to form an order. Wars are created when an order falls apart, and this is something you see in empires as well as international orders. I mean, it is a pretty steady. Interestingly, I think the form of war changes depending on the order. The Spanish, as I understand it, had this nasty habit of changing borders within their South American empire, and as a result, there were a lot more international conflicts when the Spanish Empire fell apart than there were when the British and French did. So, yeah, one of the potential implications of that is let's just stop this whole international order building thing. Let's let NATO and the EU dissolve. Let's stop funding the United Nations. Let's stop even trying, because whenever we try to do this, it kills more people than it would have if we hadn't even tried. That's such a depressing conclusion that I'm really, I'm really not too thrilled with it. But if that's the argument, I'd have a hard time really making a compelling case against it. And now I've gotten far more depressing in this talk than I ever thought I was going to. The findings in the liberal peace, the post-45 no great power war. Yeah, I mentioned the statistics very briefly. I think that war is a rare enough event, even major power wars, that 70 years is interesting, but not yet a compelling amount of time to have gone by for us to pass any conclusive judgment. Also, I think a lot of my more realist friends would argue that the coherence of Europe after the Second World War had a lot more to do with Stalin than it did with Immanuel Kant. So I'm less inclined to give the liberal peace folks that story. I think they do make a compelling case that war and even militarized disputes are far less common among democracies, But Sarah Mitchell and a couple of her co-authors have shown that, even that effect is largely driven by the Cold War. And as to civil wars in the 1990s, I did talk about, I did look into civil wars in the book because it's a question that keeps coming up, and to the extent that I was able to talk about it, I found exactly the pattern that Stein mentioned a moment ago, which is after the war, you see after the end of the Cold War, you see this actual remarkable spike in the onset of civil wars, followed by a decline, but not back down to the original level. So I think I'll just leave it at that. And I think we're just about out of time, unless my clock is wrong.
Yes, we are at the end. We have gone a few minutes over time, but please join me in a big round of applause for Professor Bear Braumoeller. Bear, you should not be so cautious about being bleak. We're in Scandinavia. We're attracted to the Nordic noir. Next week we are going to welcome Professor Maya Davis-Cross. She's going to bring matters a little bit closer to home. She's going to talk about the political crisis in Europe and the prospects for peace. I hope to see you all then. But goodbye.